So that experience that I had of that hurtling into poof took place in the summer of 1970. I was actually sleeping on this nameless friend's couch in his living room, or lying there at the time. And after that, I, of course, had to get back to that however I possibly could. I remember thinking at the time, which is interesting with respect to the work that's unfolded all these years later, I remember thinking, if I can just get enlightened that way and be able to go into that state at will, then I won't have to feel so vulnerable. Little did I know. Anyway, I became involved in a yogic practice that was also associated with social activism, which was very important to me. I'd been an activist at Harvard. And wound up going to India, actually to meet the guru of that work, and took a semester off in my senior year. So that would have been the fall of '71. Many things happened in India there during that, I think it was a little over a month I was there. None of which I have time to tell about here. This isn't the place. But while there, it became obvious to me that trying to raise my energies to get back up to that, that state, I wasn't going to make too much headway in this lifetime. It felt to me like I didn't really have that kind of talent spiritually. And having had that awakening begin in the center of my brain and go up from there, rocket shot style, none of that kind of power was happening in my meditations on the chakras and so on. And again, trying to keep the storytelling here to its bare minimum for the sake of establishing credentials. By the spring of 1972, I began to get intimations that there was something important that could take place in my heart. In fact, I even had a dream where that yogi guru who I'd gone to see, who was a very powerful master of Kundalini energies himself, said to me in the dream, "Yours is the path of the heart." I didn't know what he meant by that. But I was despairing because I knew I needed something. I needed a way to find my way. And at that point, the whole path that I had heard about through Yogananda's writings and that initial experience, and then a year and a half, whatever it was, of attempting these practices, it was falling apart. It was withering away, and I didn't know where to turn. So this is another essay from The Sun in Your Heart is Rising. It's titled, "The Sun First Reveals Itself in My Heart." In the first decade of the 20th century, around 1906, medical scientists in England figured out where the heartbeat originates in all mammals, including, of course, human beings. It's in the smooth tissue of the heart, located in the inner back wall of the right atrium, the upper right side chamber of the heart. We typically think of the heart being on the left side of the human chest. It's true that most of its mass does lie to the left of the center of the breastbone. However, a portion of it is located to the right, and it's there that the heartbeat is generated from moment to moment. Anatomists explain that a tiny electrical charge issues from that particular site, called the sinoatrial node. Upon crossing a very small cavity in the heart tissue and landing in the tissue on the other side, the charge causes both ventricles to contract, squeezing freshly oxygenated blood into the arteries. Thus it sustains our lives in all ways, from moment to moment. Shortly before this medical discovery, a young sage appeared in South India. His entry into the ultimate liberation known as self-realization took place in 1896. In the classic manner of many Indian spiritual renunciates, he hardly spoke for some years. When he did, it did not take long for him to announce that the seat of the ultimate self-realization that he had attained is on the right side of the chest, rather than in the central heart chakra or in the upper chakras in the middle and crown of the brain. This information contradicted the testimony of thousands of yogis, saints, and sages since ancient times, most of whom, in many sacred traditions worldwide actually, had pointed to the divine source of our existence in or above those higher chakras. This prodigious young sage came to be known as Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi. He had come into his realization spontaneously and was beholden to no one. So he was not the least concerned about whether others agreed with him or not. He pointed to passages in certain ancient scriptures, such as the Upanishads, that appeared to validate his contention. But in any case, to him, it was just obviously so. The seat of the divine consciousness, or its closest, most intimate association with the human body, is in the heart, not the brain. Thus, Sri Ramana often spoke of that divine nature as simply the heart. Moreover, in his later years, he came across a Malayalam book of anatomy, an South Indian book of anatomy, that specified the location of the source of the heartbeat in the right side of the chest. He inferred that the site referenced as the physical source of life in our bodies is exactly the same as the spiritual root of consciousness he had realized, the heart. When I came upon Sri Ramana's presence and teachings in 1972, 22 years after his physical death, and this was in early May of 1972, that same year I was just describing, the silent communication of extraordinary presence through his eyes instantly attracted me. I should add here that he had died in 1950, as it happened a couple of weeks before I was born. So the silent communication of extraordinary presence through his eyes instantly attracted me. And the very first time I tried his recommended meditation of self-enquiry, asking the question inwardly, who am I? And feeling toward what might be that seat of consciousness in my heart, after about 15 or 20 minutes, an astounding thing happened that would change my life. Deep in some unfathomable place in my chest, distinctly on the right side, I saw what appeared to be an infinitesimal, white-hot point of blazing light leap forward and up an infinitesimal distance. Several waves of bliss washed over my whole body and mind. Very soon it dawned on me that while the intensity of the initial experience had faded away, that feeling of an indefinable center deep in my chest stayed with me, and it has ever since, the heart. I'm not sure what else to say here, except linking things up. The place where I came upon Ramana's teaching and presence first was at a farm in Quebec that a friend of mine with whom I'd been in India when we met Ram Dass and Daniel Goleman, and who had then accompanied me when we went to meet this great Yogi Maharaji, or saint, I don't know what you'd call Maharaji. My friend and I had gone up from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to this farm in Quebec that was owned by some of the Maharaji devotees, this very close-knit group that was around Ram Dass. And I don't know how it happened. At least some of them were not aware we had been invited up that weekend. And I think they didn't really want us around, to be honest. I can't blame them. You know, somebody shows up at your farm, suddenly you got to put up with them. It's way out in the middle of nowhere. And I think they wanted to be more in their little sangha, their spiritual gathering of fellow devotees. So I felt distinctly not very wanted. And I was in the library of this place on the last day, that Sunday morning, came across this very small pamphlet called Who Am I? And I tried reading the teachings in it, and it all seemed kind of dry about the self and consciousness. And, you know, I was still working on energy yoga at that time. But the picture of this sage, and he was pictured, he couldn't have been more than 17, 18, 20 years old, and he looked like a young, later teen or early 20s person at that. But his eyes were these coal black embers of living presence that just got me. So, I knew I had to find out more about this man, even though he was no longer alive. And that night, as it happened, my friend and I drove to Montreal. He was staying with his new girlfriend there at her apartment, and they retired into her room, and I was left out in the living room with a futon and a sleeping bag. And there was a shelf or two of books, and that was where I found a book. I think it was called The Spiritual Teachings of Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi, edited by an Englishman who was his devotee named Arthur Osborne. And that was when I read these teachings, and that was when I had this experience, which wasn't a poof blowout. It was more what an Indian terminology would have been called, yogic terminology, I suppose would have been called Savikalpa Samadhi. There was not just a feeling, but a kind of a seeing of this blazing white-hot infinitesimal light, just surging forward and up. The barest distance in my heart. So that was the sun first revealing itself in my heart. And in further sessions, I'll describe what happened next and more of how it's all led to here. Pleasure to share all this with you and tell you a little bit of my life story.